Hello everyone and welcome to installment 3 of our video series on music notation. This is take 10. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the dynamics of sound and a lot about the pitch of sound. And then we'll talk about how that is notated in musical symbols. Now right now you're looking at some scientific charts of how sound behaves. Dynamics in music, the dynamics of a piece of music is the power of the sound, and it's also its variation between notes or phrases. So if you wanted a nice short definition for that, you might write it this way. Dynamics is about power of sound. Now, sometimes people use loud and quiet. And sometimes people talk about soft sounds versus strong sounds, but both work here. When they are charting how the sound behaves in terms of power, they use the word amplitude. And amplitude literally is about the amount of space occurring between the middle of a sound wave and how high it gets, how far it travels from the center line there. So if it's a quiet sound, you're going to see a small distance away from the center line. And if it's a louder sound, you're going to see a greater distance, or the greater amplitude. So when you're talking about an amplifier, you are talking about a machine that makes sounds get louder. And that's why they call it what it is. So that's why they call it what they call it. Now, pitch, on the other hand, is not about how big the sound wave is. It's about the frequency of the sound wave and how often it crosses that center line. So here we have kind of a measuring tool, and a low pitch is going to cross that center line less frequently than a higher pitch. Now, that is just about the science of it, but here let's make a nice short definition for that. So pitch is about the height or depth of the sound. Now in music, they get a little bit more specific because it's an art form, right? So in music, pitch is the quality of the sound that we judge as high or lower in the sense associated with musical melody, but it can only be determined in sounds that have a frequency that is clear and stable enough to distinguish it from noise. So I'm going to draw you an example of what I mean. Here we have 4 of those little measuring charts, and here's the difference between pitches that we would see. Here's how they would appear as sound waves, right? If it's a soft sound or a quiet sound, then it's only going to travel a little bit away from the center of the line, but it's going to cross that line very often, right? So it's just going to be this little squiggle. And if it's a musical sound, it's going to be very consistent, right? It'll be clear and stable. Whereas, so if it was noise, it might kind of look like, it might look like that. And that's the difference between musical sounds and noise sounds. So going back to our charts, if it's a strong sound and it's high, then you're going to see something like this. Now, right now, it kind of looks like I'm just doing noise. If it was a musical sound, it would be really consistent. I don't think my drawing qualities are up to the consistency level that we need, but, something more like this than like that, right? So this one's the music. Kind of. And then, of course, you put the same ideas together. And if you have a soft sound with a low frequency or a low pitch, then it's not going to travel away from that center line, and it's not going to cross that line as often. But if it's loud and low or strong and deep, then it's going to move farther away from that center line and also have a lot of space in between it. So that's how you would chart it out. Now, how do you write that down, right? And how do you figure out, how do you make a system for communicating your ideas to people, right? Well, we didn't really have one until about 1,000 years ago. Now, that was probably long enough ago. It all started with Guido d'Arezzo. He was a Catholic monk, which on the one hand meant that he sang very often. So he sang in choirs as a kid, like a choir boy. And then as an adult, he became a monk and was a choir master also. And from his childhood on, he was always trying to figure out, how could I do this? How could I make a system so that instead of everybody knowing the words, but then having to just think, oh, well, okay, so the first sound's going to go a little bit like this, and then the second sound will go up. You know those pictures that we were drawing at the beginning of school where we were just making a shape or a pathway for the melody? That's how all music notation used to be written. And so if you didn't really know the original song, those little squiggles might not tell you very much. So he decided, like as an adult, figured out that if you graph it, things will be clearer. And not only that, but he figured out you could be efficient with the spaces that you're dealing with if you not only draw dots and squiggles or whatever your symbol is going to be on the lines, but that you would also use those spaces in between the lines. And then all of a sudden, you can communicate more things in the same amount of physical space on the page, or in his case, the parchment, because in Europe, they had not figured out how to make paper yet. They had in Egypt, but not in Europe. And we're going to come back to this cool little symbol right here, because this little symbol is going to show up again. That was his first symbol for showing that these 4 lines mean a musical graph. And this guy, Guido d'Arezzo, he lived in Italy, in the town of Arezzo, between, like, we know he was alive by 992, and we know that he died after 1033. So if you add 1,000 years to that, we are talking about a man who would have been alive right now 1,000 years ago and is busy doing his job. So as you can see from this image right here, when Guido d'Arezzo first made this symbol of this system of symbols, he only used 4 lines, and that's partly because the music that he was making, what we now call Gregorian chant, only used a range of notes of about 6 notes. In fact, this is also the guy that came up with what we now think of as solfege. Now, it looked a little bit different, right? He started with ut, which later got changed to do, so that all of the syllables start with a consonant. But he's the one who came up with do, re, mi, fa, so, which he called sol, and la. And they're actually right in this piece of music. Do, re, mi, fa, so, la. So later on, people added the T, and they figured out that after that point, you've got do again. So there's our system for pitches. But look, he wrote them in different places on his little music staff, his chart, right? Each time we're at a new one of these, we are a little bit higher on the chart. And he literally used this poem that he set to music to teach people about this system. And of course, at the end, he had to make it sound like we were getting back to home. And so he came back to do. So even his song even had a tonal center. And now we come to a couple years, 100 years down the lines, right? So he started this 1,000 years ago, and like every 200 years or so, some really big innovations were made in the system. One of the things they figured out was that his system worked really well for guys' voices, right? So that was these first 4 lines of the chart. But then people started writing music that they also wanted to notate for women's voices and for kids' voices. So that's where the chart grew. Now, can you imagine trying to keep track of notes that are swimming through this huge space? That would be really, really hard to read. So they went back and decided to take out the middle line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They took this one out. And then we had 2 sets of music staves. Now remember that first symbol, right? It went from this thing, and people got more fancy with their handwriting, so it turned into this. And they called that the bass clef. Now, you don't have to write the stuff on this page down because you don't have a place for it unless you want to write it on a separate piece of paper. But pretty soon we're going to move down to the other side of your, or the other page in your PDF. And then they decided to make a different symbol that showed, like, these symbols keep track of a place on the music staff. So one of them shows the 4th line up, and the other one shows where the 4th line down is, right? Or you can think of them both as being the same distance from that central line, which we now call middle C there, but we've got 1, 2, 3 steps away, and 1, 2, 3 steps away up here. So when we're first learning how to read things, sometimes we learn them letter by letter. But in this case, I'm kind of giving you the big picture of the whole system so that you can see, look, the more you know about it, the better it gets. And then we can go back and concentrate on each note as it comes, being confident that this will all make sense if we keep thinking about it. Okay?